This marks the 5th day of the 7-day Hodlonaut versus Craig Wright trial here in Oslo, Norway. This was our second day of witnesses. We had a total of 8 witnesses take the stand. The first half of the day were character witnesses called by Craig Wright's team. The first witness was Yusuf. He was a classmate with Craig Wright. He talked about different things that they studied together. They eventually also went into business together and started a corporation. The second witness was Neville Sinclair. He's an accountant from BDO. Craig Wright's lawyer was asking a similar line of questions as yesterday, both what is your technical impression of Craig Wright and what is your personal impression of Craig Wright. The third witness for Craig Wright was David Bridges. He has a bank called Kudos. Bridges is not a Bitcoiner, and he didn't talk much about the details of the technology, but he did say Craig Wright is very educated in security law and financial services. And when asked if he thought he is Satoshi Nakamoto, he said if there is one person that could pull this together, it's Craig Wright. The fourth witness was Lynham. He's the cousin of Craig. He gave an extensive childhood backstory in the witness. He talked about their upbringing. When asked if he thought Craig Wright is Satoshi Nakamoto, he said,
"We knew for years that Craig was the creator of blockchain and Bitcoin."
The last half of the day was the KPMG expert witness called by Hodlonaut's team. The first part of it was 2 witnesses, actually, and they both kind of shared the stand and went through a very extensive metadata report. They were talking about the inconsistencies between the paper size, between the date that they had been edited, written, whether a font existed at that point in time. They also went through various drafts of the white paper, and they were pointing out any inconsistency that they could find. The last part of the KPMG expert witness was about source code, but it was very technical. I know the judge, even at a certain point, assigned a longer break during the KPMG witness, as she said this is a lot to digest. Thanks for tuning in. That wraps up this week. We'll be back on Monday to resume and finish the witness testimonies.
And now I'm pleased to introduce our reporter on the ground, Mills. Mills, thank you once again for joining us. We just watched the tape with you. Anything else you'd like to add before we dive into what went down on day 5 of the court case?
No, it was a wild day. Another exciting day. Thanks for having me back, Q. It's been a fun cadence to be in. We have officially finished 1 week, 5 days, well over halfway through this trial.
Well over halfway, and I understand that today was a lot more technical in nature, some of these conversations. Can we, do you mind sharing some of the things that you've learned, as well as just going over what exactly were the technical components of today's conversation? What is their importance, both for this case and just the broader ecosystem?
Yeah, so there were a total of 8 different witnesses technically called today. 3 were from KPMG. So the first bundle of witnesses were all called by Craig Wright's team, and they were much more in keeping with previous witnesses. The first 3 were video conferencing call-in. And then we transitioned to a few in person, and then also had Craig's autist expert testify, and then switched into KPMG, which, yes, was very technical. And so there were 3 total witnesses from KPMG. The first 2 were about documents, and they testified together. And it was metadata, and they had prepared an exhaustive report on metadata from PDFs, from different Word documents, from emails. It was really extensive, and in some ways it was a little hard to follow, in that the bundles is what they are calling these evidentiary groups of documents. They were citing them by number instead of, oh, this email with this topic or this PDF with this purpose. So it was a little difficult to know to what they were speaking to, of the relevance of it, which was, I was hoping was going to kind of come clear. But that, I know, the judge, she knows the context of each of these documents. We just, as the people in the audience, did not. So that was very technical, to the point where they were talking in the weeds about, this font was released at this date, or this paper size is standard in the US and this paper size is standard in Australia. and the ways to kind of trick a word processor software into thinking a document's older, setting your clock a different, setting your date a different on your actual computer. It went very technical as far as all of those components, but also it was then followed up by a very technical analysis of some source code as well. So I'm not a developer. I'm not going to say that I am, but I definitely have been working at being able to understand at least the nuance that's being specifically pointed out. And I didn't particularly follow. I had some follow-up conversation. I've been reaching out to a bunch of my dev friends to be like, can you explain this to me and the significance of it? So I do understand more or less what the nuance is, but I'm gonna pause. That was the whole recap cue. Any questions before I go into a light level of a technical description of what the source code evidence was?
So I just want to point out we're now keeping, for those of us keeping score at home, you have obtained and will soon be a credited lawyer in the country of Norway. And shortly, once you pass the bar in Norway, you will then, of course, become a Bitcoin core dev. Is my understanding?
Yeah, that is correct. Oh, but you didn't mention that I am now a news correspondent slash journalist as well. That was, I guess, implied in all of my new
Yeah,
career.
that was just understood that on top of all of your other work for Bitcoin Magazine and other endeavors as well, that you're a three-headed monster of a lawyer, journalist turned core developer. Truly remarkable. She is single for those men out there.
Wow, 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 wow. Let's watch out. Let's watch out, Q. Now that I'm fully doxxed, it's a different world. Thank you. So the metadata was very much focused on, this typeface or this character, or there's this many fonts, or, it's much more an analysis, and then also grabbing metadata from when something was published and when something was written. The source code testimony was talking a lot about, and I mean, I make one disclaimer. I'm so sorry if I do get this wrong, but there were kind of two different components where it was also talking about the actual source code and then the um, executable part. So the edits, and I mean, I am so nervous. There were multiple versions of edits that looked as though they were edited to um, be, have a little personality, as if you were, taking an essay and then kind of making it your own. So built on the source code, which had some implied, and this is sadly carrying a little bias because I am suggesting plagiarism, but there was an embedded bug fix already. So the version of the original source code that Craig Wright was submitting, the Hal Finney bug resolution had already occurred. So theoretically, it wasn't the source code that would predate that bug. Does that make sense? I'm so sorry.
I no. As truly the least technical human being at Bitcoin Magazine and especially on Bitcoin Magazine Live, um, what it sounds like is Craig Wright tried to copy someone's homework and may or may not have turned it in with like the corrected answer when in fact they didn't want the corrected answer. They wanted the version of it with the wrong answer.
Well,
So
it's almost like there was, like, imagine these different iterations and these different drafts. The original had a bug, had a problem. Satoshi isolated, figured out there was a problem that was then resolved. So the base layer source code that Craig Wright had been building on already had the solution to the bug. Does that make sense?
yes. Yes, I am tracking, which honestly, if you at home are not tracking and I am, So,
Yes.
duh,
There's one
this,
other thing that
sure.
I feel less. Okay, so source code had a resolved bug that Craig had built on. And I think everyone should read the comments because there are so many smarter people that are explaining this very well in a more succinct way. I'm trying to explain something I learned like an hour ago. But the other thing was that the first program release didn't have correlative changes. The changes in the source code and then in the program release, they didn't actually reflect, which normally the changes in the source code would then influence and kind of stem and inform the program release. Okay, did you make sense over there? Okay.
I am tracking. I am tracking.
So the last very technical tidbit I will add is there was quite a bit of discussion about a compressed public key that was not introduced until 0.5, until iterations through, which was in 2012. So there were we can pull out of the weeds that those were a few of the things that were discussed during the metadata source code analysis of KPMG witness.
And so let's back up to just the Hal Finney edit right now. I'm curious how, and my assumption is the KPMG witness is a Hodlonaut witness, if I'm understanding sort of this correctly.
So yeah, the KPMG team, all three of them, they were expert witnesses. So they are in the same way that the autist expert is an expert witness hired by Craig Wright's team. The KPMG team was hired by Hodlonaut's team.
Copy that. And so when presented with this evidence, how did Craig Wright's attorneys question the KPMG expert witness specific to the bug being solved?
There wasn't there was not a lot of cross witness interrogation after. It was a little bit more just a clarifying. It was, why did they have to do that change? It was a bug they had to fix. They had to remove a file. Manshaus said, well, Satoshi asked other bugs to find why, and KPMG just said, yes, I cannot speculate. So it wasn't very much of an in-depth. It was just more, yes, Finney helped to change the code, but they kept 0.1.
Interesting.
I really do apologize if I misquote any of this, but this has been a crash course for me.
No, we appreciate you wearing so many different hats and learning everything that you've had to in order for us and all of our viewers to be able to better understand and comprehend just the gravity of the conversations happening in just this one room all the way in Oslo, Norway right now, and how it frankly, like those conversations amongst was it 10 with a 10v3, like I don't know, there are like 20 people in this freaking room, and the fate of Bitcoin, BSV, and a lot of things come down to the decisions and words spoken in there. So we do appreciate all the different hats you are wearing. I'm curious now on the judge's side of things, how did the judge approach or press on the KPMG witness today?
Well, yeah, I also want to highlight the other character witnesses too, and the autist expert as well. I would say the KPMG witness, in less of an interview, it really was much more of them going through a very exhaustive report with a lot of documents. So it wasn't as much of a back and forth question. There were a couple times of clarification throughout, but at a certain point, I mean, the judge usually we take a 10-minute break, every hour and a half, 2 hours. And the judge was like, let's do a 15-minute break. This is a lot to digest, which it really was. It really has been. I think the cross-examination, I know you asked about the judge, but Manshaus, the lawyer for CSW, he was in some ways kind of trying to draw that this, like, what was the relevance? Did they actually examine Craig Wright's situation and setup? You know, like how are they making all of these assessments and claims without kind of knowing all? He asked at one point at length about like a handwritten piece of paper that if he would PDF it and send it somewhere, like what metadata are they going to get from that? And it wasn't necessarily clear what the specific argument was, but just kind of saying, okay, this is, you know, how do you know it's contaminated or not contaminated? How do you know at what point it was, you know, messed with, edited, corrupted? And then also just, you know, brought up the point, okay, well, I open it on one computer in one program, I open it in another computer on another program, that there is all of this unknown that's very unquantifiable. So I feel like, you know, the judge would have the judge was very much tracking with this, and the kind of landing of the plane of the metadata report was about the changes of a file systems level and not a file level, which wouldn't impact the metadata. And the judge clarified, would you have seen trails on file level? And KPMG said, I cannot say for sure, but moving from Linux to Windows would normally not change that. So it was discussing like the discrepancies between many places and not necessarily knowing if it's between Linux and Windows. There was definitely, it felt not like an attempt to get everything discredited, but a good poking of, you know, how do you know that all of this, you know, is actually derivative of Craig Wright instead of another source? Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I want to, for a second now, let's take the developer hat off. I need the Norwegian law hat back on for a moment. In the American court system, it is trying to prove something without a reasonable doubt. Obviously, that's in cases involving a jury. In this instance, is there sort of that line in the sand where it's not necessarily something needs to be proven or not, but it needs to be almost disproven? Like CSW needs to be disproven without any shred of doubt that he is in fact Craig Wright, or that he has to prove without any doubt that he is Satoshi in order to win this case. Is there something in that vein tied up into the legal ace of everything?
I think I see what you're saying, you know, the guilty until, or innocent until proven guilty mantra.
Yep.
To my knowledge, no. The big thrust of this whole discovery has been to give the judge the amount of data and information with which that she can make an assessment, because at the end of the day, this is a defamation case. This is libel. This is a case over tweets that, and I think actually the autism expert actually spoke a lot to Craig Wright having a legacy of being bullied and being terrorized and being, you know, treated not kindly, and brought that more as a legacy, that then, you know, not as a pity play, but as, you know, kind of that this is a pre-existing, so this is bullying, and this is, you know, something that Craig Wright has been dealing with for a lot of his life. So making it more of a factual and bringing it back to his autism as well. So I think the judge is actually trying to make this claim of, yes, this person had this understanding or maybe didn't have this understanding, you know, the with autism being a factor as well in this ruling, that maybe also was using harsh words and saying harsh things on Twitter, but also was what was being said, was that truly defamation, or is that something that, you know, is part of being out on Twitter as he previously was, and is that something that comes with the nature? And I think that's why there's been so much backstory on Satoshi, and I think a lot of the judge's questions are going back to, well, if he really is Satoshi, then this does make sense as true libel and defamation, because it would be more so bullying than if someone is saying they are someone and they're not. So I know that was maybe not a clear, succinct way to say it, but there is a lot of nuance within the judge's ruling to be able to make this informed, is this defamation?
Okay, so it's not going to necessarily be as clear cut as we in America may necessarily be used to a court decision coming out and just being plain and simple. There are ways for this ruling to kind of have a variety of different outcomes and conclusions drawn.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I don't know if it's a yes or no binary conclusion. That will be my next deep dive in my Norwegian law homework that I'm working on. But I do know that there will be a definitive decision, but what goes into that, I'm not 100% sure.
Copy that. I want to go back to unless, please go ahead.
Well, I wanted to make sure we cover the other witnesses of the day, and I can just briefly. There was a classmate, a former colleague, there was a cousin as well, of Craig, and that also, some of that family reference, and the judge, before the cousin started testifying, Lyman was his last name, the judge was like, just everyone knows, no obligation to testify as this is a family member. And then she said, okay, so since you're here, you are choosing to do this, then it was not compulsory. But that was a lot of the data, the family data was a lot of the data that actually went into the diagnosis of Craig's autism by Clin, the autistic expert. So he cited interviews with Craig's mother, niece, that it was data gathered from, and during the cross-examination, Hauke's, Hodlonaut's lawyer, was definitely saying, so you didn't have any, firsthand, it was all things that people had told you, but also the judge, very much at the end was like, so has Craig Wright ever been diagnosed autistic before you? And Clin said, no, to my knowledge, I am the first time. But he also said that's very standard in the, the age that Craig Wright is, that autism was typically undiagnosed and was not very well understood. While I'm monologuing, there was also a deep tangent on a blog or a post or something on a kind of parenting website that was discussing the parallels between autism and narcissism and the differences, parallels and differences. And Clin went very firm that, there is no definitive corollary between autism and narcissism, but it is also, he said, autism is not an immunity against having. So he was saying, yes, it's possible. However, it isn't necessarily linked. And then he also brought up, Hawkes, in his cross-examination of Clin, also brought up the Florida examination, and Clin clarified that the two main things, like, he was really asked two specific questions for the Florida court, and it was, does Craig Wright have autism? And if he does, what does that mean for the court? What does that mean for this ruling? So there was a definite, it was interesting, and I was trying to understand why we weren't allowed to film this, but I guess, there was some discussion of the, mental illness or the stigma or the misunderstanding of autism in general as well.
And I know we talked earlier this week about how one of the claims the autism expert was going to make was along the lines of Craig Wright not being able to tell a lie. And this was a piece of information that the Florida case declared that could not be shared, was not appropriate to be shared to the jury. Was that information also deemed not appropriate in the Norwegian case, or was that actually shared?
So that was shared, especially within the context that that was actually highlighted in the McCormick case in the UK. So there, Hawkes brought up that portion, and Clinton said, I wasn't involved in this case. I'm being referenced in this, but this isn't actually my report. Made that very clear delineation. But then the part that was highlighted was actually it almost a manipulation was the wording, not lie. And it was clear that it was he made it clear that it's not that manipulation is impossible, it's that it's not his nature or resting state, and not that he couldn't do it or not that he does do that, but that's not the way that he kind of operates and moves throughout the world. So that was his response. And this is a lot of degrees, right? Because this was for the McCormick case, citing the Kleiman case in Florida, witness that Klin had done, then being brought to him by Hawkes, and then Klin saying, I'm analyzing something based off of my report. So it's not that it's tenuous, but there was definitely many layers to it. But that was a clarity that did happen during the cross-examination today.
And was there anything that Hodlonaut's lawyers in any of the character witnesses, or even with this autism expert, pried out or were trying to essentially discredit?
Sorry, was there anything they tried to discredit? What do you...
In reference to any of these character witnesses, were there any holes poked by Hodlonaut's attorneys in sort of their testimonies?
Nothing really comes to mind. I would say that a lot of it is, it's a lot of it is about both the technical and the personal. And most of what Manshouse's interviews were about were establishing their respect and credibility for Craig Wright's technical prowess within business, within, their experience and exposure to his technical side, and then also contrasting it with his personal social skills and abilities. And that was also highlighted with Klin, and saying that Craig Wright was in the 99th percentile of intelligence, but he estimated him in the 1% of some like normal life functions. I don't know the exact words that he used. And the judge actually asked for clarity on that point. And it was the way in which, verbally withholding something you should say or certain behavior to not necessarily understand. I think that would go more towards Asperger's. I'm not an expert there either, but it was more just the social awareness and the way in which he would navigate normal life was kind of how he was describing it.
It seems as though these witnesses continue to hammer home Craig Wright's story. I'm curious if just there's anything in their stories or their testimonies. I mean, if I ask my mom to say anything, she's going to say anything on my behalf. Like, let's not beat around the bush here. Have those questions been brought to light? Like, have Hodlonaut's lawyers or has the judge just point blank asked family members, like, why wouldn't a family member lie on the behalf of another family member, given the stakes of given what's at stake in this court case?
Yeah, that hasn't really been a line of questioning. And maybe that's a difference between the Norwegian judicial system. That was a very funny moment I tweeted about today, but at the end of a witness said, I really like this Norwegian court of law. It was Klin saying, compared, I think, in reference to how it was in Florida. And the judge said, on behalf of the Norwegian judicial system, I thank you. And everyone in the court laughed, which was actually maybe the first time that had happened. We had some technical difficulties earlier where everyone was a little, looking around. But for the most part, it's been very buttoned up the whole time court's in session, even kind of hushed tones, even during a break or whatever. So, yeah, there hasn't been a lot of attack on the personal, and to be honest, a lot of the witnesses either are involved in business right now or have worked with Craig in the past or our family members. So there's a lot of, I guess, cross motive, or and that really hasn't been a line of questioning that Hodlonaut's lawyers have gone on.
Copy that. Mills, as we wrap up here, is there anything else we didn't get a chance to touch on from day 5 of the Hodlonaut v. Craig Wright defamation trial?
Nothing incredible stands out. I know we have a few more witnesses on Monday, and then closing statements will start, and then we will be off on Tuesday, and then closing statements will resume and conclude on Wednesday.
Well, we will circle back with you Monday. I know Monday we will have a longer recap of the trial as well as some special guests. So be sure to like and subscribe the channel down below. Damn it, I always get it wrong. Subscribe down below if you want more updates on everything going on in the Hodlonaut v. Craig Wright trial. We will have a longer recap on Monday with Mills and some more special guests. Mills, as always, thank you for your reporting on the ground. Please give her a follow at Specific Mills to stay up to date with all of her live tweeting for the trial. While you are asleep, she is hard at work. Thank you, as always, Mills, for joining us.
Thank you, Q. Bye.